and I'm here to share insights from a climate-based fellowship project on sustainable coffee production. So, I actually worked on this project, this capstone project, as part of the fellowship program with 9 other individuals. And the goal of our project was to demystify sustainable coffee and really promote organizations that are pioneering in the sustainable coffee space, and ultimately offer information to consumers on how they can drink coffee more sustainably. Now, in case you're wondering what the climate-based fellowship program is, and actually one of my fellows over there, hi, Brooke. It is a program that's designed to help mission-driven professionals really transition into the climate space or expand their career in the climate space and deepen their climate literacy. So it's been like a great program. I had an opportunity to dive into one of my favorite topics, which is coffee. Cool, so I have to start out with a quiz question, right? See if everyone's awake. Okay, so for every kilogram of coffee produced, how much corresponding greenhouse gas is released into the atmosphere? Is it A, 9.87 kilograms of CO2 equivalents, B, 33.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalents, C, 28.53 kilograms of CO2 equivalents, or D, 4.67 kilograms of CO2 equivalents? So, for those of you that think the answer is A, raise your hand. B, raise your hand. C, raise your hand. And D, anybody? So the answer is actually C. 28.53 kilograms of CO2 equivalents are released into the atmosphere for every kilogram of coffee produced, which is crazy. That's like driving your car for over 71 miles. And actually, in fact, coffee is one of the larger contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, ranking 5th amongst food and agricultural products. And it's actually has a larger carbon footprint than our beloved bacon. Now, coffee production not only contributes to climate change, but it also is threatened by it. So there are some studies out there that suggest over half of the lands that are used for producing high-quality coffee today, they're actually going to be unproductive by the year 2050 if we continue on a current trajectory of global warming. So what's driving all the issues around sustainability for coffee production? Well, climate change actually reduces yields for coffee farmers, and as coffee is the second most consumed beverage in the US, and with popularity growing worldwide, the high demand has actually led to unsustainable practices, which includes deforestation, the use of artificial fertilizers and pesticides, focus on full sun-grown monocropping, and then, of course, also human rights abuses and unfair labor practices. But there's actually good news out there, because there are a lot of wonderful organizations and companies and individuals that are pioneering sustainable coffee practices. And they have either actually implemented or they're working on solutions that really help ensure that coffee can be produced in a socially and environmentally responsible way. So here are just some examples. And it includes, for example, farmers that are transitioning from full sun monocrop farming practices to regenerative agriculture. It includes like nonprofit organizations and companies that are investing a lot in R&D to ensure that there are genetic bean varieties that are more climate resilient. And also there are a lot of coffee roasters out there that are focused on energy efficiency throughout their entire process, including roasting coffee, and also committed to sourcing beans from farms that are championing sustainable farming practices. So I'm just going to dive into one example. I didn't know what shade-grown coffee was until I started doing research on this project. What's shade-grown coffee? What's regenerative agriculture? So I thought this was like a fun example. So what shade-grown coffee is, it's a form of regenerative agriculture, and it's a type of farming practice where essentially coffee plants are grown under native shade trees. And what that does really is they grow without agrochemicals, and it actually promotes biodiversity. And an example that we dived into as part of our project and our research for this project is a coffee farm called Aquiaries, which is a coffee estate in Colombia. And they implemented regenerative agricultural practices over 20 years ago. And they've seen actually a number of benefits, including noticing that actually the daily temperature on their farm lowered by 2 degrees Celsius. It's a nice number, right? And also it was a net carbon sink, so it was absorbing 3,100 metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere annually. To give you some perspective, like what that's equivalent to, that's like taking 670 cars in the US off the road for an entire year. And this is just one coffee farm, which is pretty amazing. And so what can coffee consumers do to really support sustainable coffee production? And I think it really starts out with first understanding at a high level the coffee supply chain, which is really complex, and this is a very simplified diagram of the coffee supply chain, and it actually includes coffee farmers and roasters that we interviewed as part of our coffee project. So at a high level, it starts out with the coffee farmer who sends their coffee beans to cooperatives and mills who process and sort the beans. And then it moves on to exporter and importers who then transfer those coffee beans from the mills to the coffee roasters, which could be anywhere around the world, really. Coffee roasters then roast, package, and sell the coffee beans to businesses or directly to consumers. Now, coffee roasters and farmers who are committed to sustainable coffee practices will be transparent about this. And there are coffee roasters such as Equator Coffee and Counterculture Coffee who actually on an annual basis publish transparency reports, which contains a lot of great information about how they pay their staff, what type of roles they have, how big their company, what's their impact on the environment, and where they source their coffee from. Now, for consumers, there's also a lot of sustainability standards and certifications out there, but these can be kind of tricky because they're complicated. And just because there's a certification on a coffee bean, it doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that the coffee farmers are paying a dignified living wage. So to sum it up, what coffee consumers can do to support sustainable coffee is really just be more mindful about every cup of coffee they're drinking. Cherish it like a cup or a glass of fine wine. Drink less but high quality. And also I encourage you to explore coffee roasters that are committed to responsible sourcing, such as Counterculture Coffee. And if you're interested in diving more on our research and our case studies and solutions, please visit greenerbeanscoffee.com. That's our project website. That's where we really publish all of our information. And thanks so much for sharing your time.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name's Brandon Chamberlain. I am a Safe Street activist and amateur cartographer. And through my Safe Streets advocacy, I got into my current day job, which is I'm an attorney who represents victims of traffic violence, cyclists, pedestrians, and others that get injured on New York City streets. And I also, for the past 3 years, in partnership with Transportation Alternatives, which is a great Safe Streets organization in the city, have been tracking the city's compliance and progress in installing protected bike lanes as they are required to do by the New York City Streets Plan law. So first of all, just to get a sense of the crowd, how many people bike sometimes in the city? Okay, so almost everyone. So I'm going to start by talking about just briefly what the Streets Plan law is, a little bit about protected bike lanes, then talk about sort of the mechanisms of how this tracking project has worked. I'm going to show you the tracker itself, and then give some thoughts 3 years in on how the project's going. Oh, I'm just going to have my phone out to see how much time I have, but we'll see. So, the New York City Streets Plans law. One of the things in doing any streets advocacy, and I think it's true probably for a lot of advocacy in the city, is that so much is project to project and focused on what's right in front of you, and little, trying to step back and more holistically come up with a plan to transform the city as a whole. So the Streets Plan law was the brainchild of former City Council Chair Corey Johnson, and it was designed to address this and have the city put out every 5 years a plan of, for the next 5 years, how are we going to improve the streets? It addressed those concerns of the advocates, also, complaints from people who oppose some straight safe measures that, there's never enough input. So the idea was that city council would buy in, tell the agencies, this is the law, and then when they go out and are doing community presentations, they say, look, law says we gotta do this, we wanna talk to you about it, but here's the law. And so it was passed in 2019. The first 5-year plan was due in December 2021 and covers 2022 through 2026. For those of you real keyed in to New York City politics calendar, you might notice that December 1st, 2021 was 30 days before Bill de Blasio's term ended. And January 1st, 2022 was the first day of Mayor Adams' term. So to get this passed, basically, the deal with the de Blasio administration was they got to write the plan, but it wasn't on them to implement it. So the first plan, we're now in year 3 of 2022 through 2026. They are required, New York City DOT, to put out a report every year on February 1st saying how they're doing. Crucially, though, there's no enforcement mechanism. You can't sue and say you haven't hit the metrics. But the law itself did, for at least the first plan, say what the metrics had to be. And they included putting in 250 miles of protected bike lanes, at least 30 the first year, and 50 the next 4, and then there's 20 left over that they just got to do at some point. Put in 150 miles of physically separated from cars or camera-enforced bike lanes, install a bunch of pedestrian space, transit priority intersections, upgrade bus stops, redesign intersections, a bunch of good stuff. So, what are protected bike lanes? So a lot of hands, you guys know what they are, but the law itself says it's a portion of a street or intersection that is designed for the exclusive use of bicycles and that is separated from motorized vehicle traffic by physical barriers or is an off-road or raised pathway. Sometimes, legal definitions don't always line up with, the walking around common sense one. This one pretty much does. So it includes stuff like this gorgeous raised curb level lane near Brooklyn Army Terminal and Sunset Park, parking protected lanes like this one on 6th Avenue, lanes that are protected by stuff like these beefy plastic tough curb bollards, the more flexible posts. It also includes things that are totally off-street, like greenways through parks. Protected bike lanes are one of the greatest tools in the street safety toolbox. Obviously, they create dedicated space for bikes and other micro-mobility devices. They are self-enforcing. NYPD and DOT talk about how NYPD is a partner in Vision Zero, and enforcement is important. You see very little of that on the streets, but by putting something physically between car traffic or parking lanes and bike lanes, not 100%, but cars stay out of them more. They're encouraging cycling growth. Importantly, they decrease the gender gap in cycling. More men than women ride bikes almost everywhere in New York, but in protected bike lanes, the gap is a lot smaller, and it encourages women to get into cycling. And it makes streets safer for all road users. It's not just people on bikes, but it decreases crashes and injuries for people in cars and really pedestrians. And the more vulnerable road users, it provides more safety benefits. For seniors, it decreases the numbers of KSIs, seniors killed or seriously injured in crashes, by 39% when you put in a protected bike lane. Basically nothing else does that. And some of the ways it does is by shorting crossing distances, so you are exposed to cars less, and by taking space away from cars and narrowing the lane, cars act a little more reasonably. All right, so I'm going to talk about, so we passed the law, it went into the effect, but there was a thought that that's not enough, they have to put out a plan once a year, but between that, someone should both be keeping track of it, on a month-by-month basis, and also can't leave it up to the administration to say if they're doing things right. I trust myself more than I trust them. So, where does the information come from? So, DOT has to present every single, by law, bike lane project to community boards. They do a pretty good job putting those presentations up online. So I'm always looking out for those. There's a great person on Twitter that runs an automated bot that tweets out all of it. I've got my push notifications set up for that. People know I'm doing this. I've got a whole online network of informants who send me hot tips when they see bike lanes going in. But mostly I get out there a lot and I bike around myself, walk around, and gotta see what's happening on the streets. I also scour new satellite imagery on like Google Earth, Google Street View, open source things like Mapillary, to try to figure out what's going on. And so one of the big things I did was right before this started in 2021, we need a baseline. So I went and I researched and visited in person every single project that I knew of in the whole city that was ongoing to see, what the baseline was and what, new things would be happening. And then every year, at the end of the year, we try to update it multiple times during the year, but the most important thing is right on the stroke of midnight at New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, go out. So I borrowed a car from a family member and pulled my girlfriend in, and we drove all around the city for like 6 hours on New Year's Day to know exactly where things stood there. I'm not that technologically savvy, but so it's pretty low tech. I literally draw lines on a map on Google Maps, and that's how I measure the distances, keep track and write notes of what the progress is. I can characterize are things, have they been announced? Are they in progress? What year were they finished in? Literally just have a Google Sheets spreadsheet for every single project, and the data whizzes and communications people at Transportation Alternatives were so nice as to build me a website that's sort of hard-coded into the sheet that automatically updates when I change the numbers, and then once in a while I shoot an email to someone and say, hey, would you download the GSI files from the map and just re-upload them. So here's our protected bike lane tracker. You see I was out on January 1st, and how did we do for 2024? 23.6, that is less than 50. That is not amazing, less than half. But so at the top line number, we say how we're doing for the given year. Then we got a pretty map by year, so people can go in and click on and see all the projects that have been completed, where they are, the extent, exactly how long they are, the history, if DOT has a PDF someplace, have a link to that. And then, as I said, we've been tracking it for 3 years, and that's where we are. They did a pretty good job in 2023, almost 80% of the requirement, much less this year. The 5-year requirement, which was 60% through, is 250 miles. 34% is not 60. And when Adams was running for mayor, he said, my first term, 4 years, I'm going to do 300 miles. And we are not letting him forget that because he has not. We also got fun map layers, so you can see same thing, click on projects for what's under construction, my notes about, what was happening, what's still to come for individual projects, projects that have been announced but haven't been broken ground on. Having the data has let us do some data analysis, like tracking as projects are announced. If by law you have to present a bike lane project to a community board before you're allowed to install it. You can't install 50 miles of bike lanes unless you present projects for 50 bike lanes. So in the past year, I'm a little over, we've seen, they've announced just 21.3 miles of new projects. Obviously, you can't build 50 if you only announce 21.3. So, what's the point of all this? Because they haven't done it, as I said, I'm a lawyer, read the law. The law says they have to have the plan. They have to say how they're doing on the plan every year. Can't sue them and say, make them build more bike lanes. So 3 years in, I think it's useful and worthwhile doing for 3 reasons. One, it's a resource for the media. A lot of local newsrooms have been hollowed out, but also who's going to do this legwork. It's been cited in New York Times, Gothamist, NPR, Streets blog, when the city's saying, they're doing all these good things, then activists say, well, actually, the law says they got to do more, and it gives us something that we can point to and quote, and, here's a number. Two, it's a tool for activists. Tried to expose the data as much as possible. On the website, you can go to the bottom, click at the whole spreadsheet. You can see in your neighborhood what's been promised, has compared to other neighborhoods. Are you getting stuff promised? How long have things been taking? And so the idea is sort of one-stop shopping for, what's going on the streets in terms of up-armoring bike lanes, and that, people can use themselves, if they're community board members, if they're just local advocates, give them ammunition to argue for what was promised and, what should be promised. And finally, I said there's no enforcement mechanism built in, but we would hope the city council passed this law and they would have some desire, if nothing else, as a source of, like institutional pride, that the administration should maybe follow the laws. And so, one of the things we've seen is recently the Transportation Committee Chair, Savino Books-Powers, who is not a huge Safe Streets proponent, but has introduced a bill that would require DOT, instead of every year, to have put out stuff in real time, monthly, have basically a lot of the same data. But until then, give another resource for any member, of the City Council Transportation Committee and the individual council members, to hopefully, as they're supposed to do oversight and hold the administration's feet to the fire. And also, it is an election year, and very interested to hear from the huge slate of candidates that are running, will they follow the law? What is their plan to do it? So that is that. Thank you very much.
How's everyone doing? Good. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
In the back. All right. So my name is Ponciano. I work for a company called Delivery Associates, and we are an implementation-focused consulting firm that exclusively works in social impact. I actually was brought here by my colleague and good friend Dan Edelman, and we're both project leaders at the firm, and we co-lead our sustainability practice here in North America. But both of us, interestingly, over the last few years have also had this unique intersection with economic development, which has been a really exciting space over the last few years. And I'll try to make financing interesting for you because I personally am passionate about it and making sure that the most ambitious climate ideas, which are often very local, get the money they need to scale. And so about 4 years ago, we were in an unprecedented time of federal investments in all things innovation, ecosystem, good jobs, including climate innovation. And what you're seeing here is a portfolio of laws and acts that passed that totaled almost $3 trillion that was going in investments to place-based innovation and efforts. But what we found was that even though there was this historic level of federal funding, and the idea was to increase economic mobility and innovation, communities lacked the capacity to apply for these federal grants. And most of them didn't know how to navigate the process at all. And so that then increases this cycle of the communities that have never worked or gotten federal funds will continue to not get federal funds because they don't know how to access those dollars. So over the last 2-3 years, we've been building a solution, and we called it the Community Funding Accelerator. The goal is to build partner capacity and readiness to access the federal funds, create new solutions that deepen pathways across the sectors, And then obviously increase economic and social mobility with particular focus on students, but also communities of color. So the Community Funding Accelerator, through the support and partnership with big foundations, helps partners and communities across that journey. And we were able to do it completely pro bono. So the first step is really, do people know about these grants? Do people know that these dollars exist? Then we incubate the idea. So we often go into these communities, and there are some climate ideas that are often amazing, but they don't know how to scale. So what would it look like for that project to be sustainable in the long term? Then the grant application itself. I'm not a grant writer, but we bring in a team of expert grant writers to come into these communities and actually help them through the process. And then implementation, which is Delivery Associates' focus, we provide up to 5 months of implementation support after they've gotten those federal funds. And so we've gotten to work across the country, and we, over 2 years, were able to support 34 coalitions to apply for almost $800 million in grants. And so far, we're waiting on a few. We've reached to about $300 million in grants. And they've spanned across the United States. There's a lot in New York City, a lot of science innovation, in particular in K through 12. But wanted to show you what this actually looked like on the ground. One of my favorite projects is with the Colorado-Wyoming Climate Resilience Scientific Innovation Engine. And it is through the CHIPS and Science Act, and it was a bunch of climate tech founders who started to realize that there's an ecosystem of climate tech in Colorado and Wyoming. And they wanted to scale that ecosystem, and they saw this grant but didn't know how to do it. So we came in, supported, and then we helped them define, like, what is your workforce ecosystem? What does this mean? And then what are your outcomes over the next 5, 10 years? And through that process, they won $40 million over 2 years and are now qualified to receive up to $160 million over 10 years. And in that work, we were also able to kind of refine their idea when they say climate resilience. What is this ecosystem, and how are we defining it? So this is a little bit about how they're thinking about it, and it all results in this ecosystem in the Colorado-Wyoming engine. So if you're like me, you're probably wondering, well, there's this new administration, what does climate look like? But the reality is that philanthropies right now, although many of them have already released their 2025 strategic plans, are exploring bold ideas and their next big bets on climate. And so I would not be shocked if we start to hear over the next few months what those are. But since they're actively thinking about it, how are we helping position these communities to continue to have funding for their ideas? And so we often coach the communities we work with on what we call braided financing strategy. And that's just fancy language for talking about different sources of funding so that they can do this work regardless of who's in the administration. So what does that look like? Braided funding leverages multiple funding streams, and we think about it in 4 ways. Federal funding, which obviously over the last few years was a great source of funding. But over the next 4 years, we'll see. We don't know. Then there's philanthropic funding. Gates, Bloomberg, Walton, they're all thinking about what does this mean for our climate portfolios. Then there's local state funding. I think what we've noticed in communities is that they're aiming big and going to federal dollars right away, when really there's a lot of really exciting opportunities at the state and local level. And then finally, local funding. A lot of these big philanthropic partners often have local family members in those communities that are actively trying to see where the big ideas are and how can they finance it. And so we think about it in 5 steps. There's a logic model. What is your idea? How can you scale it? Refine it. Developing a list of funding sources. Align that to the logic model. Assess those opportunities, and then develop an action plan. And so this Community Funding Accelerator, communityfundingaccelerator.org, is completely pro bono. So if there are people that are interested in applying for those grants, they can go to the website. And then we have free resources that would allow I don't know, a climate engineer somewhere in Wyoming to apply for a grant, and we're able to support them along the way.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me host here today and speak to you about floating solar. Okay, podium's a little tight. Great, so floating solar. My name is Gilberto, and I got invited here by Noah Siegel to speak on floating solar. I have a background in renewable energies. I won't bore you with that. I'll get right to the point, and floating solar is basically a very unique idea that was started by a company called Solitaire, and that is expanded throughout the entire world. The US is a little behind on that. So we'll start off with what is floating solar? Move that thing there. Cool. What is floating solar? So floating solar are also known as floating photovoltaic FPVs, referred to as solar panels, installed on the water bodies such as reservoirs, lakes, industrial ponds, quarries. You usually want a body of water that doesn't move a great deal. You want some source of stability for that. And it's growing in efficiencies and eco-friendly alternative to land-based systems. So similar to like coffee, you want to protect some of that land that's out there. You want to protect development for rural purposes, and offers dual benefits of electricity generating and reducing water evaporation. So this will be covered a little later, but one of the unique things is now the sun is being taken in by the panels that are on the water, so now you're eliminating that evaporation, which we don't see so much of here. Actually, there is quite a bit of here in Massachusetts, but there's a lot of that in California. So why floating solar? Well, land efficiency, right? It eliminates the use of vast land tracts and preserves valuable land for agriculture, urban development. That is a big message with floating solar. They want to save the land. You know, we have all this water that's not being used, and you don't really realize it until you get involved in floating solar, like how much water is actually out there that's not being used. It improves energy yield. So this is kind of interesting. So solar panels have their own triggers within them that if they get too hot, then they'll produce less, depending how they're strung in most cases. So in this particular case, because they're sitting on water and the water is a lot cooler, now the solar panel's yielding at its highest level because it's preserving that panel from getting very hot. Environmental impacts, it reduces algae growth and of course evaporation of water on the bodies while generating clean energy. So algae is a big problem in California. And even I was at the New Wall festival, they're big gathering this, and the New Wall is basically the main body of water for the whole, what you would say Massachusetts, Vermont, and their big concern is algae. They're talking about different chemicals they have to put in for algae, so that's a huge concern. The other thing is market growth and potential. So global floating solar capacity has been steadily increasing. Yeah, there's I would say about 4 gigawatts of power that is currently now being produced. And I have a few examples that I'll show you. It's ideal for countries with high population densities, limited to land reserves. Japan has got one of the larger ones. The Netherlands is also very active, actually. I have a funny story about that. Expected to contribute significantly to renewable energy targets globally. So what I thought would be interesting is to kind of show you how it's doing. So here, floating solar, stand back this way, I can't really see. Floating solar globally. So these are the countries that will cross the 500 megawatts of cumulative FPV, which is floating solar installation by 2031. And you can see that China is really gearing itself very strongly. So is India, so is Indonesia. They're all going to meet that threshold. Your compound average growth rate for floating solar is expected to be about 15% in the next 10 years, and 15 countries are forecasted to exceed that 500 megawatt of cumulative FPV installation by 2031. I actually read a little article that was shared with me by Noah earlier today. I think we won't hit a gigawatt of power in the next 10 years with floating solar. It could be a little disappointing. So this is Indonesia, India, and China are making up almost 70% of all the total FPV demand in 2022. So here's the global market when we're looking at US market value. So the revenue currently in 2022 was 35.6 million, and then it's forecasted by 2030 to be 180 million point two, and then your compound average growth rate over the course of those next 7 years will be 2023 to 2030 will be 22.5%. Also thought it might be interesting to just see where the U.S. is doing, right? We're actually lagging behind more than any other country. Our revenues by 2022 are 2.5 million, and it's forecasted by 2030 to be 13.9 million, and your compound average growth rate from 2023 to 2030 will be 23.8%. So incentives for adaptation. You know, some of this information is applicable depending on the project you have, but these are pretty basic. You have the federal incentives like the investment tax credit, the ITCs, that's 30%. You have federal in tariffs, FITs, which guarantee purchase of generated power at a favorable rate. You have net metering, most of us probably understand that. The operator may receive fixed payments for each unit of electricity fed into the grid. You have grants or rebates, programs like the U.S. Department of Energy, Solar Energy Technologies Office offers grants to reduce upfront costs, carbon credits, we all know how those work probably. And you have renewable energy certificates, RECs, you can sell those to corporations. There's a lot of ways that you can generate revenue. And then as you go into each in particular state and some local areas, they have different incentives available. Massachusetts has particular ones. And then I thought this would be interesting, because now you're wondering, like, what is floating solar, right? So what they've basically taken is they've taken the concept of a canoe and Lego, in my opinion, and combined them. They've broken it down into, I'm glad I got to laugh somewhere. They've broken it down to really, really small pieces. So it's very easy to assemble, very easy to ship, because it's actually just boxes of things. And these are two different manufacturers, and as you can see, they're small little pieces. It also, the buoyancy of it allows it to then flex, because you'll find, so this is a funny little thing, I'll see how much time I have. 2 minutes, maybe not too much. I'll keep going. Maybe I'll have a second to say it later. Installation process is pretty interesting. You obviously want to choose a body of water that is big enough so you can fit it. You want calm, you want accessibility to this body of water. You often get these reservoirs where they have these huge walls and you can't really access it, so that's challenging. You want depths. You don't want it too deep. It gets kind of tricky if it gets too deep. In the mooring, because you also moor it and you mount it on land. Minimal ecosystem distributions, engineering and design. You account for factors like the wind, and you'll actually put a wind technology item on site to measure the wind, to measure the current, to measure how high the water will go over the next course of the next 6 months. You want it to be durable. You're going to use what they call an HPDE, which is a high-density polyethylene. If anybody can help me pronounce it later, I'd appreciate it. Mooring systems, ensuring stability with mooring cables or anchors. So what they basically do, and I'll show you that in just a few seconds, they're going to put moorings on the ground, and then they're also going to tie it onto land. And that'll kind of assure, and there's a little more into that we can always discuss. And then panel installations, pretty simple. I'll show an image of that in the next minute. Grid connection, we all understand that. The main one there is if you do use, if in some cases they want you to put the cables underwater, now your cost is going to go way up. Where you can do waterproof cables above land, and I'll show you what that looks like in a few minutes. Inverters, this is interesting. Almost always they want the inverters on land. However, I'll show you an image in a few minutes that will show you how inverters can also be floated. So here's a quick image that I found online I thought describes it easiestly. So here you have possible reduction of algae growth. You have the increase of energy and yielding due to the cooling effect. You have the moorings of how they're actually moored, right? You have the above grade electrical equipment going on here. No land requirement, easement to deploy because of the flexibility and the mounting ideas. You're going to keep a boat on site whenever you do floating solar. They're not going to want you, especially in a reservoir, they're not going to want you to move the boat off. They don't want to contaminate, the body of water. And this kind of gives you an idea of how it works. One problem is, you are reducing algae, but then the light does not create any vegetation like algae for fish to, eat. Challenges of floating solar, it's high impact investment, compatible to land. I would think you have a lot more studies that go into play here. Okay, I've met my timeline, but a lot more investment than you would, primarily because you're dealing with so many different agencies, and they're going to require a lot of due diligence that's going to be needed. Maintenance, it can be a little complex on the water, and monitoring systems are one thing. I wanted to quickly show you these quick case studies. Someone asked if there actually is one in New Jersey. Sayreville Reservoir in New Jersey is actually 4.4 megawatt floating solar array. And then in construction, I just recently learned that they've now announced 8.9 megawatts of floating bifacial. These are where the bifacial panels, which are kind of amazing. Solar array at the water treatment facility located in Millbourne, New Jersey. This is amazing. This is that project in Japan. Koryosera is an EPC company, has announced that its latest floating solar FPV power plant on the Yakakumara Dam Reserve in Chiba Prefecture, Japan, is operating at a maximum of 13.7 megawatts. It's actually the largest in Japan. And this one, I think, is the coolest one. This is 119.7 megawatts of power in India. And this is Madhya Pradesh, India. And what's interesting here is they actually use robotic anchoring combined with the rock bolting, because they went as deep as 25 to 30 meters. So we're talking about 90 feet deep, And then in conclusion, finally, the future of FPVs. Obviously, the more it gets used, the more the efficiencies improve, the cost reduction goes down, manufacturing cost goes down, lower cost driven by innovation, economic of scale, integrated with other remarkable renewables like hydro and wind and energy, and obviously battery storage is a big component that's actually required in all projects in the future. And expansion, actually I've seen some projects that are going offshore. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right, thank you. Good to see everyone. Good to see you, Brandon. Thanks for your presentation. I'm Hunter Armstrong, Executive Director of Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, and just want to tell you a little bit about what we do. We're a nonprofit based in Brooklyn. We were started 20 years ago with a group of citizens in Brooklyn who wanted safe access for cyclists and pedestrians and runners between waterfront communities in Brooklyn, and also better access to the Brooklyn waterfront. And for anyone who's lived in New York City or Brooklyn for a while, you can probably attest that the Brooklyn waterfront has changed in really dramatic ways over the last 20 years. So I love knowing that there was this vision 20 plus years ago by folks in Brooklyn. So in 2025, or kind of wrapping up 2024, looking into 2025, we have kind of 4 major program areas, and I'll touch on those a little bit during this presentation, and happy to discuss more afterwards. So we continue to focus on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the entire Brooklyn waterfront, as well as additional greenways that are being designed and planned for Brooklyn. We advocate with city government, since the greenway is on city property, and also engage communities around the greenway system in their communities, just so they know what it is, they know where they can go on it, hopefully they don't oppose it, kind of building up a constituency of knowledge of greenways. In fall of 2024, we also completed a major data study of greenway use based on kind of 32 sensors that we had installed along the greenway, the 29-mile greenway, as well as doing intercept interviews with over 1,000 greenway users. So I don't know if I'm gonna have time to really get into that in this discussion, but possibly in a future one. We also operate a green space on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway called the Naval Cemetery Landscape. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And we also are the founding convener of the New York City Greenways Coalition. We'll discuss that too. And so I've been with the organization for 2 years. My academic and professional background is in urban planning and nonprofit management. And over the past 20 years in my time here in New York City and in Brooklyn, I've worked for 4 different nonprofits that have all been focused on improving the public realm through policy and advocacy and also public space improvements. So that's a little bit about me. Okay, so what is the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway? So this, those of you who are familiar with Brooklyn, this is Greenpoint. This is Shirley Chisholm Park in East New York. If you haven't been there, please go. That should be a field trip maybe for this group. So this is 29 miles. The Naval Cemetery landscape, which we'll talk about in a minute, located within the Brooklyn Navy Yard, is approximately in this location. Prospect Park, Greenwood Cemetery. Continued focus of my organization. Brandon kind of touched on this a little bit in his presentation, like, protected bike lanes, greenways can kind of take on different forms depending on where you are and aren't always sort of making a contiguous user experience for New Yorkers. So we're really focused on kind of, again, like educating people about where greenways are located, where they can go, how they can use them. I think a key distinction with greenways is that they are long. They are long linear spaces, kind of providing mobility and hopefully green space. So I just have a few slides just showing what the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway looks like in a few different locations. So I think an ideal greenway for me is space for bicycles, space for pedestrians and runners, space for green, space for horticulture and plants and nature, all separate from automobile traffic and safe from automobile traffic. And linear, spanning many communities. So this is an example on Columbia Street in the Columbia Street waterfront. We've got the nice protection. We've got some space for pedestrians and cyclists, not really separated. No green in this photo, so some work to do on that one. Actually, Brandon had a much nicer photo of this same location. This is Brooklyn Army Terminal, exactly on 2nd Avenue. So your sunset photo is better. So this is a new section of Greenway, as Brandon mentioned. We've got the space for pedestrians and runners. We've got the space for cyclists. We have the space for green. Unfortunately, the green is not being maintained here, but that's a different conversation. So this is a small segment that eventually will link into Jamaica Bay and Sunset Park. But right now it's just sort of a standalone section. So this in some ways is kind of the model of what a greenway looks like on DOT right-of-way. This is by the Navy Yard in front of the Naval Cemetery landscape. This is Greenway. The Greenway here is, the protection is provided by this concrete barrier, but unfortunately not much green here. But it is, for those of you who travel between Williamsburg and downtown Brooklyn, this is a very key corridor, a very popular place. And then sections of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and other greenways across New York City go through New York City Parkland. They are, managed, operated by New York City Parks. So this is the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway along Jamaica Bay, fully separated from traffic. Really a glorious area. A little bit hard to reach. There are fewer access points to this section of the Greenway than, say, some of the previous slides that we saw. So just a kind of an overview of some of the focus for Brooklyn Greenway Initiative over the past year and looking into 2025. We completed the user study, as I mentioned. We convened the second New York City Greenway Summit in September, kind of bringing together policymakers and government employees working on greenways, advocates, coalition members, and other members of the community advocating for greenways, as well as consultants. There's a large kind of design, engineering, public engagement infrastructure that's being funded by city money and federal grants. So bring those three stakeholders together. Brandon mentioned some legislation earlier. There is also legislation to complete a citywide greenways plan in December 2024, as required by City Council. The city missed the deadline, but they're making some good progress on it. And then early action corridor planning, we'll talk about that in a minute. So New York City Greenways Coalition includes Transportation Alternatives, Regional Plan Association, some other large organizations, as well as very small community-based organizations coming together around kind of shared, we all have our own geographic priorities, what we want to see in our own communities, but we're coming together around shared priorities around policy and advocacy and equity, design and maintenance, really big issues. Our steering committee consists of these groups. You may recognize some of these names. We have a website, greenways.nyc. I advise you check that out. These are some of the big issues that we're kind of taking on, sort of speaking as one voice as a coalition for our respective communities. Inequity, more investment needed in what we call legacy greenways. Brandon again mentioned this as well, turning bike lanes into actual greenways. Moving along, the greenway system, like your map was really illustrative, like showing sort of individual segments of greenways and productive bike lanes, but not really connecting to a whole, because we all want to, if we're going for a run or a ride, we want to be able to reach other communities, not just our own. And just sort of the inherent complications that greenways are managed by different city agencies, Department of Transportation, New York City Parks, sometimes built by the Economic Development Corporation. These are all city agencies with very different priorities and resources. So just a kind of public engagement opportunity coming up. The City of New York has received a federal grant through the RAISE program for greenway planning. This is purely for planning, but they are leading public engagement processes along each of the green lines here on this map. So if you live near one of those places or use those areas, want to see a greenway in those areas, we can connect later about sort of where those are in the public process. So our role is, as a coalition, as an organization, is, you can see a lot of question marks for timelines on this slide. So it's basically, we're not entirely sure when the city will start these things. They will announce a timeline and then for a variety of reasons not be able to make it. And so we're just getting the word out, educating people about this public process is coming up. And here's what the greenway is, here's where you can go on it, here's what you can do, when the city is ready and its consultants are ready to start these public planning processes, you're ready and you know what you want to see. So I'll just be super quick talking about the Naval Cemetery landscape. I think for a greenway to be truly green, the city, private partners, nonprofits, communities need to build their own green space. So in some ways, the greenway is just kind of a brand. Like everyone can be sort of, engaging the greenway in some way. And I think if this kind of incrementally happens block by block along the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and other greenways across the city, then eventually we really will have a place and we'll have this sort of green necklace, to use a term like that. So the Naval Cemetery landscape is a green space, public space that Brooklyn Greenway created about 10 years ago within the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's a historic site, it's an inactive cemetery. We kind of redesigned it as a natural area meadow, accessible to the public. We have environmental programs there, et cetera. It is directly adjacent to the Brooklyn Queens Expressway and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a very kind of large industrial park. Not much nature around there, but pretty cool spot. So this kind of shows its relationship to, this is that concrete barrier area that I showed in an earlier slide. So anyway, come out to Brooklyn and hang out with us. We have concerts, we had a film screening here earlier this year, or last fall, so a series of public programs there. So this is a way to engage with us. A lot more we could say, but yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Marta Gutierrez. I am a certified energy manager, and I work for a company called the Association for Energy Affordability. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me here tonight. Thank you guys for being here. So tonight, we're gonna talk about how to boost energy efficiency projects in affordable housing and how to make these projects cost effective. First, AEA is a non-profit organization. We are based in New York. For the last 30 years, we have provided energy services for thousands of building owners, including owners for multifamily buildings, affordable and not affordable. I'm proud to say that AEA is one of the few companies that have helped building owners transition from gas to electric for buildings that are affordable, existing housing, also using air source heat pumps. So we have 3 projects. We are working in electrification as well. So first we need to define what is a low-income building. So this definition depends on the program that the building is applying for. We are talking about the Polarization Assistance Program. This program defines low-income building as a building where at least 66% of the households earn less than 50% of the area median income. For the Inflation Reduction Act rebates, at least 50% of the households needs to earn less than 80% of the AMI to be qualified as a low income. If we are talking about the context of NYSERDA incentives, at least 25% of the household needs to earn less than 80% of the area median income. So just to note, for a household of one person in New York, the AMA is 79,200. So why energy efficiency is important and one that matters for low-income housing? So a typical building that is affordable housing, the mechanical equipment is not updated, the condition of the envelope is not up to code or need to be upgraded. So this leads to higher consumption energy and high energy bills for the building owner. So when we propose an energy efficiency project, we not only look about the condition of the equipment, we also look for improving the living condition of the tenants. So what are the typical recommended measures in a building? When we work on an energy efficiency project, we always take a look at lighting upgrades to LED for units, a common area. We look for envelope improvements from anything from air sealing, window replacement, and installing insulation on the roof. Many of the buildings require boiler upgrades and installation of energy management system. Another measure that we always recommend is pipe insulation because this will help the building to be in compliance with local law 87 as well. So what is the typical payback of these measures? If we're talking about pipe insulation, could be anywhere between 2 to 10 years. For lighting up upgrade, can be between 2 to 5 up to 10 years. If we want to replace the boiler, the typical payback is between 10 and 20 years. If for envelope measures, if we want to replace the windows, can be anything between 20 and 300 years, depending on the type of windows that we are installing. So the question here is how we're gonna do this project. Wow, this project is cost efficient if the payback of each measure is too high. So I'm gonna show you 2 case studies. One building complex located in Brooklyn. This building complex has 559 residential units, 1 pollen plant, providing heating for 2 buildings. We recommend 14 energy efficiency measures, including envelope, replacing the window, air sealing, pipe insulation. The total implementation cost was 1.6 million with a payback of 16 years. For this building, we apply for WAP incentives that are federal incentives, for NYSERDA and utility incentives as well. So this incentive covered 100% of the total implementation cost. After 2 years of the completion of the project, we did an energy analysis. We found energy savings of 24%, which translates to cost savings of 19% in energy bills. So at the end of 2 years, this building could save around 100 grand per year with zero out of the pocket money. The other building was located in Queens. This building complex has 180 residential units, one boiler providing heat for 4 buildings. This project, we implemented 10 measures, including envelope, and also we recommend to transition from oil to gas, and installation on one separate system to provide domestic hot water. The implementation cost was 1.1 million with a payback of 17 years. We apply for incentives, WAP incentives and ICERTA. The owner at the end pay around 12% of the total implementation cost. After 2 years again, we did the energy analysis. Energy savings were about 25%, which translates to 22% in utility costs. So after 2 years, the building is now saving 68,000 per year. As a result, we have 2 years payback, which already pay off. So when you see this project, you see that when you go to the building and you want to implement an energy project, you want to generate a package of measures that help the building to apply for additional incentives. You want to target measures that help the building to upgrade the equipment, and target measures also that help the building to comply with local laws.